Now, you don't need to have an interest in bodybuilding per se to take an interest in this story, although if you do have an interest in bodybuilding, it's that much more interesting. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is of relevance, I think, to all men, but specifically to men of higher status. But the long and short of this story is that the current Mr. Olympia, Shawn Rhoden, who won last year in an upset against Phil Heath, has been accused of carnal despoilment. Now, this carnal despoilment accusation has come quite suddenly, and they posted his bail at a whopping $750,000, kind of out of the blue. And I'll get into the details and nitty-gritty of the story, which doesn't make a lot of sense, to be honest. But another aspect of this is that with this accusation of carnal despoilment, he has been completely removed from competing in the Olympia, not just the forthcoming one in 2019, but all future Mr. Olympias because of this accusation. Now, supposedly what happened, and this is where the fishy story comes into play, a friend and confidant, a female fitness competitor, went up to his motel or hotel room by herself with a cameraman waiting downstairs, at which point Shawn Rhoden engaged in illicit or inappropriate behavior. Supposedly, he began touching her in inappropriate places, and allegedly, there are lacerations on the inside of her sheath. And on top of that, it is claimed in the report that Shawn Rhoden had entered her sheath with his sword, but only the tip of the sword, which doesn't really make sense if you consider the claim of lacerations. Furthermore, this woman in question is and was married, which adds a bit of mystery to the story because she went by herself to a hotel room with one guy and so on and so forth. It's very, very murky. Now, as is custom with these types of cases, the accuser's identity is being hidden and is protected, but the accused, in this case of carnal despoilment, his name is widely known, and more or less his career has been shut down. He doesn't have many years left to begin with. He's in his 40s, and people predicted him to be the winner this year in Mr. Olympia, but he'll never compete again. And this adds a whole layer of complexity to this. But needless to say that there is an obvious inequality in the system when the person who's making the accusation can essentially get off scot-free with her identity protected, and the person who receives the accusation of carnal defilement is maligned, whether he's guilty or not, and that's a different question, for the rest of his life. Now, personally, I don't know whether or not Shawn Rhoden is guilty in this matter, but he's an extremely high-status man, at least in that area of the sporting world, bodybuilding, and you could say more broadly, he is Mr. Olympia after all. So whether he's guilty or not, my sense on these matters is that both identities should be protected until there's a conviction or the person is let free and exonerated. This double standard persists to this day, and it is extremely damaging to the men in question. Because obviously, whether you've done it or not, the reputational taint that you gain through that accusation remains with you for the rest of your life. And of course, if you've actually done it, fine, you'll be in prison. That's a crime. But if not, it doesn't matter. You might remember years ago that story of an aspiring NFL player who was accused by some woman, who was put in jail, and later, years later, he's exonerated because she admits that she made the whole thing up and she had to pay a fine. This is, frankly speaking, ridiculous. Now, do I think people would be reasonable about changing the double standards involved here? Absolutely not. The double standard is in place for kind of obvious reasons, I think. Reasons that the audience would be likely familiar with. But the fact that he cannot be given the benefit of the doubt, innocent until proven guilty, as is customarily the case in official legal proceedings with respects to other aspects of his life, is very, very shady indeed. Now, I think this might be a 50-50 case. The story is very, very unclear in the details. There seem to be contradictory accounts. Shawn Rhoden, of course, claims something opposite, that she approached him and that they had some kind of arrangement, but it's just not clear. And apparently, to add fuel to the fire, this woman has had some kind of obsession with him, and there might be some element of revenge here. It's not entirely clear. So, with this lack of clarity, we cannot simply assume he's guilty, especially when it carries such dire consequences. His career is over, gone, done. And there's another important aspect here. What happens if he, in fact, is not guilty and he's exonerated, his career is gone, and the woman will be penalized in some capacity, but it will not be nearly as severely as he would have been penalized. And my sense on this is that if you're willing to level extreme charges, such as an accusation of carnal despoilment, then you also need to be willing to pay the piper when these charges turn out to be false, with the equivalent prison sentence. You can't simply point fingers at men and ruin their lives. And again, it does remain to be seen if Shawn Rhoden is guilty or not. But you cannot simply point fingers at men, ruin their lives, and just walk away if it turns out to be not true. And more often than not, this is typically the case. The penalty is minuscule. So in the case of Brian Banks, the aspiring NFL player whose career was cut short and his life was ruined through years of imprisonment, years later after he had left prison because he had caught the woman in a recording admitting that she had made the affair up, I believe she had to pay something like $1 million in fines. I would suggest, though that's a lot of money, that is not the equivalent of sitting for years in prison and then having essentially electronics attached to you to keep track of where you are because you're a registered offender. It's absolutely inscrutable and ridiculous. And then, of course, there's another element to this. The simple lack of wisdom involved in this whole affair. Now, I'm somewhat sympathetic to Shawn Rhoden, but if you're Mr. Olympia, you're very, very high status, obviously. You should never, ever, whatever your status might be, but this is especially true of high status men, be caught in a room or location by yourself with some woman that has a quote-unquote interest in you or some kind of more intimate relationship with you. It's very, very risky, especially when the nature of that relationship is not entirely clear, if feelings are not mutual, if it doesn't even matter. These days, in light of the I also movement, which really isn't a movement but more something people do online at random willy-nilly, in light of this I also movement, you see a lot of caution on the part of men across the globe. Leaving the door open, making sure other people are around. This is exactly the type of behavior that is warranted in the current climate and atmosphere. It is a climate and atmosphere of fear that demands caution and circumspection when dealing with members of the opposite sex. It seems to go without saying these days. But this is a classic case in which he had said, no, sorry, I need to go to bed, or I want to be by myself, or you simply cannot enter the hotel room. Or the cameraman who allegedly was waiting downstairs could have accompanied her, and that wouldn't have been a problem. Again, she was married, went alone to the hotel room by herself with a cameraman waiting in tow, and then supposedly, after all of this, went straight to the police after supposedly, allegedly, he had entered her sheath with his sword, but just the tip, which caused damage within the sheath. It's a very, very odd story. So a couple of takeaways from this gentleman, and I think this is a healthy reminder to all of us. Whatever your status might be, but particularly true of men of status, never, ever, ever, ever be caught in a location or place alone by yourself with somebody of the opposite sex. If you do not know the person, if you only sort of know the person, and even if you do know the person, extreme caution is warranted. Leave the door open, have other people around, keep your distance, stay away, do not engage. Even in the mainstream, it is generally acknowledged that the I also movement has caused men to act with real caution, as in they do not want to engage in mentoring activity for people in the workplace who happen to be of the opposite sex, and rightly so. Why would you want to risk your life and career? Again, that single accusation creates a taint that you can never, ever, ever get rid of. And Barbarossa in the past, the late great Barbarossa, has covered similar stories of men who were accused, and then just based on the accusation of carnal defilement, everyone in the town is suddenly against him. Doesn't matter whether or not he's guilty. They think he is. And in some cases, these men have been subject to violence. In some cases, these men have lost their lives, either through their own hand or through mob, quote-unquote, justice, even after they've been exonerated. And it's something that could be at least improved and corrected in the so-called criminal justice system by either hiding both identities or making both identities known. I would prefer that both identities be hidden. And if it turns out that the person who has been accused is guilty, so be it. But if not, then no one's ever known about this. That seems to be the fair course of action. And there doesn't seem any bulletproof way of avoiding this sort of thing these days, especially if you're a man of status and a man who's just in the public limelight. And this is just such a potent reminder of what you shouldn't be doing. Do not ever, ever be in a room alone with somebody of the opposite sex that you don't know, that you're unfamiliar with, that it just doesn't work. And I hope for his sake that he's not done it, but even assuming he's not done it, his life will be ruined. And the accuser will get off more or less scot-free with some minor penalties. Who knows? We'll see as the story proceeds. It'll probably take some time for everything to progress and move forward, but I thought it was important to talk about this because it does remind us of the clear and present danger men are in, especially men in the public sphere. No man is immune to this, and the fact that somebody can be toppled with the utterance of a few words is very, very telling. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. If I'm still alive, I will check you out later. Bye-bye.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.